So, welcome to everybody. This is the first episode of the What's Your Grief? I guess we're going to just call this our community podcast. Just kind of just like a discussion that we're having and sharing in our What's Your Grief community and with the podcast listeners that we still have out there. So, welcome everybody. So, Lisa and I were talking yesterday about what we wanted to discuss, and there's been something that's I feel like always kind of on my mind a little bit, and it has been especially on my mind because last week we were asked to write an intro to our publisher's newsletter. So for those of you who don't know, we just wrote a book. It's going to be released on September 27th, and it's available now for pre-orders for anybody who's interested. And our publisher was asking us if we wanted to write an intro to their newsletter about grief and loss. And they suggested the loss of summertime, which initially, being in the world of grief and loss and having experienced our own losses ourselves, we were like, we recognize all loss is loss, but we're like, really? Like, that's such a small thing. And I had to think a lot about it. And eventually I really did come to the realization that what we were really talking about is just loss of time. And that is something that really resonates with me. I think since my mother died when she was 57 and I can't ever remember, I think I was 23, maybe 24. Ever since then, I have felt that time is just ever more important in so many different ways. I'm constantly thinking about how much time I would have left if I lived to the age my mom lived to. Lisa and I call this grief math, where you do those calculations where I ask myself, okay, if I live to 57, how old will my youngest child be? Will I be able to get them to adulthood? How old would my mom be now? What would she be doing? Would she be in retirement? So it's something that really, really has resonated with me in so many ways, both thinking back about the past and also thinking about my moments and how precious my moments are in the here and now. So we wanted to talk a little bit about time because we think it's different for everyone. Just last night, we had a little bit of a meeting in our community, and a lot of people were talking about time in the sense that they're in the second year of their grief and really feeling that it is the absolute hardest thing. And the first year was hard and the second year feels harder for many people, they were saying. And this is something we hear all the time. And so time in that regard, I think, is something that is really tricky and can really kind of intersect with grief in a lot of interesting and surprising and sometimes frankly distressing ways. So we wanted to talk a little bit about it and hopefully hear back from people who are listening about how they feel about time. Lisa, what is your thought on this very broad subject?
On the very broad umbrella topic of time. Well, I think one of the things that is a challenge with this is it just goes back to one of those very basic kind of misconceptions about grief, which is this idea that it's going to get a little bit progressively easier every day. Like, I mean, we've said this before. I think people think that grief is like recovering from an illness and you get a little bit better and a little bit better. And then it, maybe even if you don't think it goes away, you think that it progressively is getting easier. And then we hear from so many people about this feeling where they realize, and it's not always just in the second year, sometimes it is realizing in the middle of the first year, at 6 months. So I think that it can be at all different times that people will suddenly realize, wow, it isn't feeling easier. And part of that, I think, is because of that experience of realizing as time is passing, I'm becoming more acutely aware of how far I am. I'm getting further and further away from the time that I shared on this planet with my loved one and when they were here. And so I think there's that looking backwards piece where we feel like we're getting further and further away. And that feels like we're losing that person even more, the more each day passes, or in the case like of summer, like the more each season passes. On the other side, there's also, I think, a part about looking forward with time. Like you described, there's, these aspects of the second year, I think part of it is looking back and saying, wow, we're even further away. Now we're facing, the second birthday without them, or the second anniversary, or just, or just time is slipping through. Another summer is ending that they weren't here for. But we're also sort of looking down the future, and looking at that reality of maybe, last year I was just trying to survive, and now I've been able to put my head up enough that I can see that after year 2 is year 3 and 4 and 10 and 20, and that aspect of time in grief can start to feel really overwhelming, and really, there's this new weight that it's like, now I'm not just trying to survive, I'm trying to figure out how to feel connected with what life looks like going forward. So I think both of those are things that really jump out at me when I think about this topic.
I think something related to what you described, it's that for me, and with comparing the first year to years after that, I think it's this sense that when you lose someone, you lose them like all at once, and then you also lose them in pieces, bit by bit over time. It's really weird because they're gone, you've lost them all at once. Like, there's no mistaking that, and you feel that very acutely. But then you start to realize it's like secondary losses over and over again, when you realize that, the smell of her clothes is faded, or what I would give to, hear my mother's voice again, and I can't imagine it anymore. And those little pieces of them, a lot of the sensory stuff, those really tangible connections, they do begin to fade in a lot of ways. And there are things we can do to hold on to those things, right? Like take pictures or keep items and things like that. But it's not the same. And there is so much that gets lost that we can't hold on to. I remember within the last 6 months, I think I wrote an article for What's Your Grief that talked a little bit about how now my mother is very much kind of an abstract for me in a lot of ways. Like, she's not this tangible being that she was for so long. And it sounds dismal, I think, for people who want very much to hold on to their loved one in a tangible way. And so it's not as bad as it sounds. I have a very close psychological connection to her, but I guess what I'm trying to say is, for me, there is a lot that I grieve in an ongoing way about just those tangible, very realistic connections with her. The other thing that what you were saying kind of made me think about, and this is a little bit of a shift, is just that I have this feeling now because I work from home. I have a toddler. Like, it sometimes feels like the days are really long, and the weeks are long. Sometimes it feels like there's not, a lot to get excited about. There's not, you have a hard time struggling to really connect to purpose, and to really feel like, who am I in this world? So the days feel really long. In a lot of ways, you're kind of like, oh, can this day end? But then the years feel very short. And so that's kind of how I feel a little bit about grief sometimes. Like, the days feel like a slog. And sometimes it just feels like, oh, can I just go back to sleep? But then when you have a chunk of time that's passed and you look back in retrospect, you're like, oh my gosh, so much time has passed. And that gives me panic because there's so much time since my loved one was in this world. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, I think that, yeah. No, I think that makes total sense. And I think that sense of panic that comes when thinking about the numbers, like that the numbers make something feel, it quantifies something, where like day to day, most people, there are people out there in grief who count the days that it's been. But I think in general, people are aware, have that feeling of, wow, I'm either struggling to survive the day, or I compartmentalize and I survive the day just fine. And I plug through it. But then, the nights are hard, or the weekend is hard. And I'm kind of losing that sense of time, like you described. But then a specific date comes up, or a specific moment comes up that triggers us thinking about how much time has actually passed. And I think once our brain puts a physical number on it, it carries this new weight. And we posted about this on this idea of like kind of grief math on Instagram, and time passing, measuring time, thinking about how long it's been, how many birthdays have passed, And so many people, when I was reading through their responses and their comments, it felt like there was sort of this, well, one, this like, yes, I thought I was the only one who did this. I'm relieved to know I'm not the only person doing these kind of calculations, and feeling kind of distorted about how time passes, and somehow feeling at the same time that it has been an eternity since they died, and also it feels like yesterday that they were still here, and or different variations of that. But also that there was just like sort of a pressurized anxiety that went with it, that there was a feeling of like, when these numbers come up for me, when these days come up and I suddenly go, wow, so, a number of people commented on, the number of, soon I'm going to have had the same number of years with my loved one that I had without them, like whether that's the amount of time that we were dating and then married and, together, or with, if it was a child who died, how many years they were alive compared to how many years they died. And, our brains do all that math, and it suddenly feels like a very weighted
Yeah.
number in some way. And, I don't know. I think it's just, it becomes real. Like it's something concrete and tangible that's like, it gets you out of that haze of just kind of going through the day-to-day routine. And suddenly it's like, you see that number, or you think about that number, and it's just this real kind of wake up moment of the reality that we're living in. And I think that can be really hard. I think COVID has also
Hmm.
distorted time for people. Like there are things that just blow my mind when I try, not grief related, but just life related, when I try to think about when it was. If it happened between March of 2020 and now, there are a lot of things where I can't tell you whether it happened 3 months ago or 24 months ago. And I'm not great with time to begin with, so part of it is that. But I think layering that on top of this, and the fact that time for, I think, a lot of people during COVID has felt more distorted than ever,
Yeah.
means that these numbers are even more weighted when we see them, when we realize, oh, wow, sort of the summer is gone. This is the end of my second summer, my third summer without them. All of a sudden that number makes that very fluid feeling of time, or that abstract feeling of time, feel real.
Yeah. Bringing up COVID, it makes me think also just how those who lost loved ones people experience so many different types of loss during COVID. So we really have to expand it to those who experienced any type of loss during COVID. There's people that have this timeline in their mind of how grief is supposed to be. And we already talked about how the second year can be harder, but I think that COVID especially even kind of messed that up even further, because people were denied the ability to have a lot of the traditional ceremonies and rituals and rites that they would have around their loved one's death. I think also because part of grieving is really having the very difficult experience of having to engage with the world after the loss, and go to the places that remind you of the person, see the people who remind you, or who have the questions or the comments, things like that. That is a big part of grieving. And for those who lost a loved one during quarantine, that part of the grief was delayed in many ways, and so their grief happened and was still very much present during those years where, or I don't even know how long it was for people at this point, during the time that they were really under kind of quote unquote lockdown or quarantine. And then it was a little bit prolonged for a lot of people because they had to, after that fact, in a delayed way, go out and have those experiences. So for many people, their experience probably looked very different than it would have had COVID not been a thing, or that they probably even anticipated or expected.
Yeah, I thought about this so much when I was reading Mary Frances O'Connor's book, The Grieving Brain, which came out earlier this year. And, I thought it was just such a fantastic and fascinating book. And one of the things that she talks about is, it's sort of saying time heals is very deceptive, right? Like time doesn't magically heal. But what she does talk about is our brains, part of what happens, and she really goes into a lot of the neuroscience of our brain, is that, our brains have mapped the world with our loved one in it, or our loved ones in it. And so we come to expect them everywhere. That feeling that you have so often in early grief of like, you just think you're going to see them, like sitting in the chair where they always sat, or you look in their parking spot and you can't believe their car's not there. Like, that is because in a very neurochemical, like in a very like neurological way, we've mapped the world with them there. And one of the things that she talks about is that experience that we get through living, and our brain's expectation of remapping that kind of happens with time, has to happen through exposure and experience in the world, sort of encountering the places, going to doing the things without them. And that doesn't magically mean time heals, but it does mean that our brain starts to get more and more experience with the world without them. And so it starts to become a little less jarring that they're missing from the world, something about that happens. And I thought so much about COVID and how that was taken away from so many people. Now, if you lost someone who lived in your home with you, you still had all those home exposure, but you still didn't have the, going to the places where now maybe you didn't go to some of the places that you didn't go to your bowling league with them, or that you usually went to week, or you didn't go to the gym and play tennis together, or to church, or to whatever those places were. And so even though now maybe it's been a year since they're gone, the first time you go to that place and they're not there, your brain's last mental map of that place is of them being right next to you. And so I do think there's this it made me think a lot about that with the passage of time. And I think for my personally, having lost two friends at the very, very beginning of COVID, one actually in February 2020, and then in March. And these were, I lost two friends who then suddenly all my friends' interaction disappeared, right? Like, I stopped seeing people at all. And it felt so, that period where it's always going to feel like shock and, disbelief, and where you're reminding yourself over and over again sometimes that a person is really gone, not denial, but like, that sort of shock about it. I felt like that was so extended for me because I wasn't seeing anyone. So there were so many moments where I would see something and just think that they were still here. I was reminding myself over and over and over and over again because of that. And I think it took a lot longer to get out of that shock, numb period for me, because it didn't feel, it kind of felt like, oh, maybe it's just like all my other friends where I'm just not seeing them because of lockdown. So I definitely thought a lot about how all of those things during COVID really distorted stuff for us.
Yeah, the Mary Frances O'Connor stuff is so interesting about the brain and mapping and having those experiences. And it really does highlight how avoidance of people and places can make things a lot more difficult because we don't have those experiences. So in a way, we're living in a world, that's a little bit different than the one that's out there, because we haven't gone and had those experiences and sort of forced our brain to remap in a ways. And I could see where that might actually even be like an appealing idea to somebody. Like, I don't want to map the world where my loved one doesn't exist. But of course, we know that avoidance can play all sorts of tricks on people and cause all sorts of problems. So one thing that, as we've been talking about how complex like this issue of time is, and how, talking about how even over a decade later for us, time is still something that we grieve, and then we still, after all this time, grieve our loved ones. It just makes me think about the disconnect there is between what society tends to expect of somebody who's grieving and just how long and complicated the experience of grief is. It's lifelong in many, 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 many cases. And so I think it's just interesting to think about how our world around us might have such a different expectation of what our grief is supposed to look like and how our grief is supposed to be after a certain amount of time versus what is reality. Something that Kenneth Doka, researcher, said about disenfranchised grief. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term, disenfranchised grief is when people deny people the right to grieve something based on just the type of loss they've experienced, or maybe their expression of loss is something that isn't socially accepted. So there's a little bit of a stigma and a shame around it. That's a very Reader's Digest version of that. But what he said is that every loss eventually becomes disenfranchised. Eventually, every loss becomes stigmatized to a degree because after a certain amount of time, society just sort of expects people to be back in the world in a productive way, having moved on, not talking about the loss. Many people expect people to go, quote unquote, back to normal. So it really just really highlight that contrast for me between what is expected. It's like that meme on online, the expectation versus reality, right?
Yes, absolutely. No, I think that's a huge piece of it. And I think it applies, we talk a lot about how society, other people impose that on us. And I think when Kenneth Doka talks about disenfranchised grief, it's very much based on that idea when society doesn't give us permission or they feel like we should be doing differently. But part of it is our own expectation, like going back to that idea I mentioned of, I think that we do think that we're supposed to be moving through at some pace that we've set for ourselves, or we look around and we compare. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot in talking to some people one-on-one and in the community has been about comparing within support groups, and people talking about that experience of sometimes joining a support group where there are other people who experienced loss of the same type of relationship. Maybe they also lost a sibling, also lost a spouse or a parent or a child right around the same time. And all of a sudden they're measuring like, okay, these deaths happened at the same time. And yet these other people in the group feel like they're moving through their grief quicker than I am, or that they're on a different timeline than I am. And so a couple people mentioned that experience of sort of counting the passage of time for themselves, but also in comparison to others around them who are grieving, and then feeling this, I must be failing at grief, or I must not be grieving as well if I'm not on the same timeline as someone else. Now, there's no magic timeline of like what the right timeline is, but I think people often create ideas about what they think the right timeline is. And then if they think someone seems like they're doing better or further or what, and there's a lot to that, right? Like we only see what other people are putting on the surface. So who knows? There's certain ways that one person in grief might be doing really well outwardly in terms of, they're back to work and they feel like they're functioning and concentrating and doing all these things. But then in another area, maybe they're still deeply in avoidance of places that they just can't return to, or, at night they're barely functioning at all. And then someone else, it might be quite the opposite. They can't get back to work. They've tried to go back and they can only go part-time. They're struggling to get through the day. They're still really in, that moment. But in other areas, they're really, engaged in a support group. They're back to doing, some of the self-care stuff. They're going to the gym again. So a lot of times it's not a one-to-one connection, but we're like mapping it out in our brains as we're looking at these other people around us and comparing how long they've been grieving and how long we've been grieving.
Well, right. And we start learning about how people grieve from a very young age, right? So, and we don't learn it correctly necessarily. Like we build up a lot of assumptions, some correct and some not correct, based on what we watch in TV and movies, based on people in our lives that we've seen. And a lot of people don't show outwardly the struggles that go on inwardly. So we come to build up a lot of assumptions about how much time things take, how grief looks. And something we've recently talked about, Lisa, is just how people grieve and cope in such different ways. And for many people, grief doesn't look like that emotional expression necessarily. It often does look like diving into activities and work and volunteering and things like that. Things that might make a person say like, oh, they're not struggling as much. But in reality, that's just their way of grieving and coping. So it just looks different. So I think like the takeaway here is just comparison can really cause a lot of it can cause a lot of beating oneself up, and it's often not based on reality. I had to have this conversation with one of my kids just yesterday, is that, you think that someone else is so good at something or so much better at something than you because of what you see, for example, online, and they're curating that, right? How many takes did they take before they put that online? I think that's something that we talk about too in the grief space, because there is now so much grief content online, on Instagram, TikTok, everywhere. And some of it's great and very normalizing, but some of it can feel a little aspirational, I think, for people who are, really in the thick of it. And they see someone who's maybe, oh, I'm a year out and I'm a butterfly now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think I notice a lot how often people, especially in the space of like grief coaches, will mark their timeline, and as part of almost how they advertise themselves, of being like, just 18 months after my husband's death, I just saw this the other day and it like hurt my soul. I managed to kind of this list of things that they, I guess, viewed as accomplishments that were less grief focused and more were like, I started a new business and I, bought a new house. And I just thought, wow, this is the kind of marketing that really emphasizes this problematic comparison, this problematic timeline piece. And, the reality we know is that sometimes when people rush through all these things that then look like they're making a checklist of like, look how well I'm doing, sometimes that really sustains and they really are doing well and it's all great. And then sometimes people crash and burn a little bit and realize that they were using some of those things as avoidance or as bypass of their emotions in early grief, and threw themselves into some of these new products and projects in order to not sit with some of their feelings, and used some of these these new shiny objects as ways to distract from the grief. And that can come up later. And that's not always the case, right? I mean, it can go both ways, but we've been doing this long enough that we've definitely heard people come back and say, wow, I really thought, that I was doing great. And now I realize that what I was doing was avoiding my grief. And now I need to go back and learn how to sit with these feelings and learn how to cope with it.
As we wrap up the conversation, I think whenever we can, and we can't always, it's good to share anything constructive around the topic. So I wanted to just take a minute. I think a lot of what we would have to say that could be constructive is stuff that hopefully you already know. Like, for example, that grief is, for many, I would almost say for most people who've lost someone they love, it's forever. And so that is normal and okay. And the grief takes as long as it takes. And it is expected for it to bubble up over time. Years later, when you do that grief math, and maybe you are the age that your loved one was, or maybe so much time has passed that you're thinking about, my loved one would have graduated this year, would have gone to prom. Oh, all their friends are starting to get married and have kids. Your grief is going to bubble up over time, and that is very normal. Grief is not something that we ever put a full stop on. So just saying that it takes as long as it takes, and it's totally normal to carry it with you. And like we just said, not to compare oneself to others.
Yeah, I think I would add with that is that can sound discouraging to people at first when we say grief is forever. And I think it's important to remember that what we mean by that is not that the pain of the acute grief is the same forever. Not at all, right? Like it changes and evolves, and we learn how to carry it. We learn what we can do to manage, certain things. We get better at anticipating what's going to be hard. We learn who our support systems are. We learn the things that are giving us meaning and purpose and allowing us to get out of bed in the morning, even though that is happening alongside of our grieving. So it's, I think, important to be able to see both of those things at the same time, that both that loss is always with us, and also it's always evolving in ways that ultimately allow us to live in the world a little bit
Yeah.
differently than we do in those early months and that first year. Even though that second year can bring new challenges that can feel hard and daunting, oftentimes there are also a lot of things we've learned in the first year that then help
Hmm.
us tremendously as we're getting through the second year and the third and beyond.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. That is a very important distinction. And I would say, having experienced loss myself and grief, and just having worked and talked to people who are grieving, at a certain point, when you have learned to kind of live alongside grief, and when grief actually becomes that little reminder of the thing that, the thing or person or time or all of those things that you really love, it's, in a way, it's welcome. Does that sound really weird? Right now, in where I am in life, I think I can say, like, grief is like a spiky little companion that I wouldn't want to leave. I carry it with me everywhere, and sometimes it pokes me and I'm like, hey, rude. But in general, like, I would never want it to go away, because it is a part of my love for my mother, who will always be one of the most important people in my life. Does that sound insane?
No, I think that I think a lot of people really connect with that. I think it's the reason that for a lot of people, when they hear that the five stages are not how most people in modern, grief, mental health, and support think about grief, are relieved, because I think, and though I think this is a misunderstanding of Kubler-Ross, but still, I think that idea of acceptance led people to think, okay, the goal of grieving is that I put it behind me and I move on and I accept. And I think oftentimes for people, it's a huge relief when they end up in a grief support group or with a grief counselor. They've come and they've read our articles or, listened to something, and they hear, like, no, grieving is about having a relationship with the person who died, and
Yeah.
that's going to be with you always. And it's going to be hard, because it is like the spiky, thorny thing, because with the most comforting memories are all of, there's the bittersweet, right? Like there's always a sadness, like that's going to be
Yeah.
with it. It's all rolled in together. But I think that there's a relief people feel when we can say, that's what grief is. It's learning to
Yeah.
hold on to that forever in a way that still allows us to live in the world and be connected with
Mhm.
hope and values
Right.
and other things and people. So I think
Yeah.
it sounds spot on.
Well, the last thing that I would ask, and this is something that we would love to hear feedback from the listeners and people in our community as well, is if you are somebody who feels like time is passing and you're losing important memories, sensory memories, tangible things, and you're really grieving that loss, are there some ideas that people have for what to do, for how to cope? I think something we've talked about can, of course, be things like photos or things to treasure if you have them. Not everybody does have them. Um, we've talked a little bit about journaling as a way to write down memories and to really get detailed about memories. Um, what other things might you add, Lisa? I don't, if you have any ideas.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that can be helpful with this too is just talking to other people. A lot of times we have our own memories and we can kind of try to write those down and think about those things. But oftentimes, and I think about this with people I've lost in my family, it's just interesting who remembers what, and which things stand out. And sometimes someone else shares a memory, or shares not even sometimes just a memory, like it's something about a person that then triggers you remembering this whole thing that you had completely forgotten. Or they share a memory that sometimes you didn't even remember yourself, even if you were there, because memory is is complicated. But you're able to really find a lot of comfort in that. And I think then the other thing is, and I'm sure talk about this, we've talked about it in the past, and I know we'll talk about it again, is just sometimes remembering when we're very connected to those physical objects and those things where it's like their clothes and the smell and certain things that we know eventually we're going to have to let go of, and that will by nature, at some point disappear. Being able to think about what is it that represents, and what is it that feels comforting and important, and sometimes it's that connection, and thinking about that and knowing what that is, what that feeling, what is the feeling that went with that person's smell that was so comforting, and what is it about those certain things about their voice, like what are the aspects about it, like what feeling did that bring you, and trying to remember those things, because those are things that, again, it's bittersweet, like we'll never feel those exact things again, but being able to remember that, what that
Hmm.
represented and how that
Yeah.
felt, is sometimes easier than remembering the thing itself.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I think that can sometimes be, at least for me, I think that has sometimes been a bit of comfort in thinking about certain people with aspects of the my sensory experience of them that has been lost.
Something else I think that can be really helpful, that you mentioned talking to friends, but also going back to places where you have memories. Now, going back to places can feel really, really hard if there are really difficult memories associated. And when I say difficult, I mean it could be difficult at times, or not great memories. But I also mean memories that were good that you're worried are going to bring up a ton of emotion, and so you're kind of fearful to return to those places. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time to be able to return to that place, and it's okay to take your time, but we do encourage you to try and get to the place, right, to eventually return, especially if it's someplace special to you, because being in a place, it gives you those context cues that can then trigger memories that you didn't have before. So there is a lot of benefit to returning to a place, even if you have to really find coping skills to take with you into that experience to deal with the emotion that bubbles up. Going back to talking to friends and family who knew your loved one, it was also mentioned in the chat that sometimes it's helpful to talk to friends who may have other stories about them. And that reminds me of one last thing that I have to share, is that sometimes it feels like, for myself and for also many people that I've spoken to, it's not just about building up your own memories and reinforcing your own memories. It's kind of about adding to your memory bank by taking the memories of others or sharing the memories of others. I had an experience like this where I talked to my mom's identical twin. I wanted to know what my mom was like when she was in college, when she was a young mother. I wanted to know more about her because she died before I had the chance to really have an adult relationship with her and learn those things. And so it was an amazing experience for me. And when I talked to my dad as well, to get these memories that aren't mine, but they kind of add to my memory bank a little bit. And this is something that we often recommend to people who didn't know the loved one. Maybe it's a sibling who died before they were born or when they were very young. Maybe it's a parent they never had the chance to know. So this is something that we often recommend to people, is just talk to people. The grief is around the loss of having any memories there. And sometimes there are things that can be done to at least, learn more about them and share the memories of other people.
I completely agree with that. Well, I think that kind of closes out at least some of the general thoughts, at least that I had about this, Elle. I don't know. Did you have anything else before
Sure.
we round out?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I feel like this is a topic that I revisit constantly. And I think that's very normal for people, for one, who are grieving, just who are living in the world, who are getting a little bit older. Time it's a thing. It's a very important thing for many people. So certainly a topic we'll probably revisit again on our website and here and in our community. So we want to thank everybody for joining us, both in the What's Your Grief community and also through the podcast feed. As a reminder, we're going to be recording these in the What's Your Grief community on Thursdays, and then we will be sharing to the What's Your Grief podcast feed on Fridays, every Friday except for the last Friday of the month, which we will hold to connect with our community. So you can always reach us at whatsyourgrief@gmail.com if you have any questions, topic suggestions, anything like that. And we are on social media, pretty much anywhere you can think of: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, even TikTok, and we're at What's Your Grief everywhere, I believe. Yes. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we will talk again soon.